He lived and worked at a crucial time in the history of his nation, and came to embody the very spirit of his people. But it was far from an easy battle. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Bedřich Smetana. This language has a lot of sounds my dumb American face can't say, so we're going to do our best. Roll the intro. Bedřich Smetana was the first son in a large family, whose patriarch, František, was the master brewer of the small town of Litomyšl. His mother, Barbara, allegedly danced well into the early hours of the morning, then gave birth before sunrise. What can I say? They were just built different back then. Bedřich got the basics of music early on from his Haydn quartet-loving dad. When he was 16, he wrote that he learned the violin at 3, and by 4, he was taking the lead role in Haydn quartets. Which I find a little far-fetched, but he also made his first appearance in concert when he was 6, so I'm not going to put it past him. He grew up in, I guess you could call it new money, but they didn't keep it. Throughout his childhood, his dad worked his way up the social ladder, and the Czech language was only spoken by the peasants and the commoners. Anyone who was anyone, or wanted to be anyone, under the Habsburgs spoke German. To the point that, growing up, the Smetanas did not speak Czech, and Bedřich was known by his German equivalent, Friedrich. As Bedřich got older, the family gained wealth and moved on to what I can only call kind of a luxury farm just outside of town, and so he was sent off to a series of schools where he met and befriended Karel Havlíček Borovský, who was 3 years ahead of him and encouraged him to move on to Prague, an experience of overwhelming beauty and cultural richness, where a well-meaning cousin made sure he got into the exclusive grammar school, where his provincial ways made him stick out so badly that he left. For the first time in his life, he didn't have much money, but he more than made up for it in the richness of his musical life and his social connections. He led a string quartet, and as he couldn't buy the latest scores, he would arrange to hear performances and then transcribe them later from memory. Like I said, they were built different back then. He also wrote a decent amount of music for his group, but only fragments survive. He was already well committed to the musical path when Franz Liszt roared into town, and hearing the great Hungarian master sealed the deal. So smitten was Smetana that he wanted to become Liszt, destroyer of pianos. He wanted the technique. He wanted to write virtuoso music in that style. And this was, keep in mind, a pretty frail and sickly kid. It was a far cry from Liszt's towering, sexy beast. In addition to being on the small side, Smetana's face had been rendered permanently asymmetrical from a childhood accident where a bottle of gunpowder blew up and gave him a bone infection. I'm kind of surprised he survived that. Built different. His plans to become the next Liszt were rudely interrupted when Daddy Smetana rolled up and realized his first and most beloved son was a truant. So Bedřich packed his bags and came back to the countryside, where his parents were debating whether or not they should send him off to become a proper farmer. Back home, he wrote his first surviving piece, Louisa's Polka, written for his first love, his cousin. Built different. His uncle, I think the same one who got him into that grammar school he hated, offered to take him to a school in Plzeň to supervise his studies there as well. Immediately, his musical talent, specifically playing Liszt and Chopin like second nature, attracted local attention. Plzeň is the 4th biggest city in the modern Czech Republic. Back then, it was the sort of mid-sized town that would get some traveling artists. And yes, the word Pilsner, like the beer, comes from Plzeň. If there's anything I learned during this video, it's how much the Czechs really like beer. Pilsner was invented around the same time that Smetana was there, actually, so his bud's for you. This isn't Budweiser, this is something a little bit more authentic. Zdrovia. Not worth the tariff. Speaking of beer, his family had fallen on hard times after a crop failure, and while his dad wished for Bedřich to follow in his footsteps and become a brewer, it was clear to anyone who knew him that he was best fit for music. František Smetana had objected to music as a career because it was so financially uncertain. Now, in such hardships himself, he agreed music was the right path. Smetana came back to Prague with a pocket of money and a third of a room at a cousin's house in which to stay. He went hungry, trying to stretch his meager funds, and even worse, his crush didn't want to talk to him. He could barely afford to rent a piano, so lessons were out of the question, and at nearly 20 years old, he was too old to enter the conservatory. So what was he going to do? It was his crush's mother that introduced him to Josef Proksch, a blind musical polymath with strong opinions on music that mirrored Smetana's own tastes. And Smetana badly needed the theory help. He had no idea why certain notes went together or why certain forms made sense. Proksch knew Smetana had valuable keyboard skills and hooked him up with Count Leopold von Thun und Hohenstein, where he became a live-in music teacher to their kids. And he did theory homework with Proksch by the boatload via correspondence. Now that I said it out loud, I'm not entirely sure how he did that when Proksch was blind, but that's not something I researched. They did counterpoint, they did orchestration, choral settings, and of course music for his own instrument, the piano. Smetana would poach the best bits of these early pieces for a lot of his later work. All this time, political unrest was afoot. The Czech language and identity were extremely circumscribed and outright banned in many contexts. Nationalist sentiments swept across Europe, and in Smetana's immediate artistic circle, the romantic model of genius was Hector Berlioz, who had taken Prague by storm in March 1846. In June 1847, Smetana resigned from his position under the Count. Though he wanted to be a composer, and felt he'd learned much under Proksch, actually making it as a composer? Not the easiest ask. So he decided to pull together a tour as a recitalist, which immediately fell apart because nobody showed up to his first concert. This would be something of a recurring theme. He went back to Prague with his tail between his legs, back to a threadbare existence. He wanted to make enough money to help him start a music school. Desperate, he sent his fresh Opus 1 to Franz Liszt, and asked Liszt if he would be their dedicatee, and if Liszt would kindly find a publisher for it. And also if he could have a big loan. Liszt did everything but the loan. It was his word that got the 6 characteristic pieces in print. 1848, of course, for anyone who knows their European history, was a massive wave of upheavals and revolutions that reached Prague by April and turned violent by June. Dreams of Czech autonomy were scattered to the wind. We don't know how much Smetana directly participated in this short-lived uprising, if at all, but we can get a little bit of a clue by looking at some of the music he was writing at that time. Some of it is militaristic in nature and quotes the music of their imperial oppressors. That sounds weird, right? But the Czechs weren't necessarily agitating for independence. They were agitating for autonomy and, legally being allowed to use the Czech language. Smetana, like many of his countrymen, hoped that the new emperor, Franz Josef, would institute reforms and accept the crown of King of the Czechs. Smetana also set poetry that openly called for revolution and cited great Czechs of the past to back him up. Franz Josef's engagement to Duchess Elizabeth of Bavaria brought with it renewed hope for Czech national interests, and Smetana provided a triumphal symphony to mark the occasion, only for the piece to be ignored. Not even so much as a thanks but no thanks. Brian Large, in his hefty volume, or should I say large volume, that's one of the only English language biographies of the man, speculated that this piece was ill-received because he didn't put Haydn's Kaiserhymne, at the time the imperial hymn of Austria, front and center. He works it into the piece, but it's not like hitting you in the face over and over. He was able to put on a local performance, but due to a scheduling goof, it was sparsely attended. The piece then sat for decades, until Smetana revisited it in 1881 and turned it into the Festive Symphony. By the end of 1848, he started to get his musical institute off the ground. Rocky at first, since he didn't have quite enough money, but he still had connections among the aristocracy, and it was modeled after Proch's own institute. Smetana's set itself apart as an explicitly Czech school. The ill-fated revolution had awakened Smetana's spirit of national identity and pride, and he wanted to pass that along with a tendency towards more modern music. Things were looking up. The school was coming along. He married Kateřina Kolářová, and gosh, drink every time you hear me mess up the Czech language, or we're going to be toasted by the end of this. They had 3 kids in 4 years, and he even got a gig playing 4-hand piano with the former emperor and his unstoppable forehead. In half a decade, Smetana had gone from a motivated nobody to a respected member of Prague's musical life. His music, as he entered his artistic maturity, came to embrace all things Czech, mostly in assimilating folk dances like the polka. Modeled after Chopin's treatment of the Polish mazurka, Smetana sought to transform rustic folk pieces into respectable concert works. This domesticity was not to last. Within 2 years, the Smetanas lost 3 daughters, including their eldest, Bedřichka. As callous as this might sound, if she hadn't died, he wouldn't have written his G minor piano trio, a work indebted to his inner gloom. We don't know why Smetana left for Sweden, exactly. Large suggests that he was goaded by the pianist-composer Alexander Dreyschock, who floated the idea of Sweden to Smetana, and suggested that he could hook him up with a gig up there. Liszt, who loved the G minor trio, may also have put the idea of travel into his head. With a few successes and a lot of hardships under his belt, maybe Smetana just wanted a fresh start. The Czechs had been under the Habsburg thumb since 1620, and their rule in Bohemia was characterized by absolutism, which is kind of exactly what it sounds like. A comprehensive lack of political autonomy meant that artistic freedom to the Czech meant leaving. Smetana was hardly the first Czech expat in that regard. No matter what led him there, the fact is Smetana left in October 1856, headed for Gothenburg. It was, like today, Sweden's second largest municipality. It was a relatively wealthy melting pot, but hardly a cultural capital. Smetana was a big fish in a small pond, and his recitals were such major events that a month after he got there, he decided he'd set up a school of music just like he had in Prague, and literally everybody signed up. Oh, and he also became the director of all amateur large ensemble music in the town, and introduced them to bewildering modern music, the likes of which they had never before heard. Like Mendelssohn's Elijah. Despite his oddities to the townsfolk, they really seemed to love him, and they invited him to every social function where he was able to wine and dine. Well, I guess more like beer and dine where he came from, with all the moneyed classes in town. People understood that this small German-speaking man was single-handedly putting their town on the musical map, and they were pretty thankful for it. Money was always tight, since Gothenburg had a higher cost of living, and he had to send money back home. He came back to Bohemia in 1857 to find his wife deathly ill from tuberculosis, and his surviving daughter Zsofia ill from scarlet fever, and his father a month away from dying to boot. Gothenburg's northern climate wasn't exactly ideal for Katarzyna's battered lungs, but its musical climate treated Bedřich better than Prague's, and with nothing left for them in Prague, it seemed, the whole family went up to Gothenburg, conveniently via Weimar, where Franz Liszt had set up shop. The Smetanas heard the world premiere of Liszt's Faust Symphony, and once again Liszt's music made something click for Smetana. That winter he attempted a huge piano fantasy, Cid and Hymene, based on a Herder poem. The project went nowhere, though he was able to reuse some material from that about 2 decades later. His next stab was a Shakespearean tone poem, Richard III.
Deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up.
Both of these pieces show his desire to be like Liszt, to write extended works based on poetry and dramatic narratives. Shakespeare had quite a following in the Czech lands, believe it or not. He returned to Shakespeare throughout the rest of his career. Where Liszt would write symphonic poems based on general moods, Smetana wanted the music to follow closely to the plot. So his next project was Wallenstein's Camp, based on a Schiller play set near Pilsen. Followed by an adaptation of Macbeth that only emerged at the end of his career. One that shows he'd assimilated another one of Liszt's big things, which was harmonic progressivism. I dare say that Smetana went further faster. Katarzyna hated it in Gothenburg, where weather and the language barrier kept her indoors and unable to help her husband in this music school that she had back in Prague. She would occasionally visit some places with somewhat nicer climates. Mostly she just wanted to go back home. Smetana blamed himself and swore to leave Gothenburg as soon as he could, return to Prague, and give up the music school business. But first, he had to give a few goodbye concerts. They left town in early April, but were forced to stop in Dresden, where she died on the 19th. Smetana was inconsolable. Granted, she did have tuberculosis in a pre-antibiotic world, so it wasn't like he killed her. All the same, his selfishness exacerbated her condition and caused her undue suffering in her last years. And he knew it. Well, who better to snap a guy out of his funk than the irrepressible Franz Liszt, who summoned Smetana and dozens of his friends to Weimar. Liszt shared his thoughts on Smetana's tone poems. It also helped matters that Smetana fell in love pretty easily. Even while Katarzyna was still alive, he had something of a tryst with his married pupil, Frödia Benecke. In the 3 months after Katarzyna's death, he rebounded not once, but twice, falling for one of Liszt's pupils, and then, while staying with family just south of Prague, he fell for a young lady named Barbara Ferdinandova, Betty to her friends. He popped the question, she put him in the friend zone, and then her dad, who felt a lot of social and financial pressure that came with having so many unmarried daughters, urged the two to wed, and she accepted. They mostly tolerated one another. I don't think she ever fell in love with him. With no reason to stick around in the Czech lands, he went back to Gothenburg and immediately restarted his institute. And he seems to have been in a pretty weird place. He was engaged, he was still grieving his dead wife, and he'd moved back to the hometown of his muse, Frödia Benecke. He doesn't read like Betty even liked music. He wrote a piece for her, and she rejected the dedication.
This is a real low point. Yeah, this one hurts.
Now, once married, she was able to get out and about at parties, but she made it clear from the outset they were not going to make their home in Sweden. And even if Betty weren't in the picture, I don't think he would have stayed in Gothenburg a whole lot longer. The institute was no longer growing, and a lot of the top musicians had gone on to greener pastures elsewhere. It was time for Smetana to do the same. After a short tour to other Swedish cities, the Smetanas came home in April 1861. He would visit Gothenburg only once more in his life. His time away from home made him miss home even more. Absence watered the seed of nationalism within him, and with it came an appreciation and use of the Czech language, and of elements of native Czech music. It helped that the Italians, in their push for independence and unification of their peninsula, had teamed up with the French and dealt a striking blow to the Austrian Empire. In response, the government reorganized. Baron Alexander von Bach, who had held absolute power for a decade and had crushed Czech dissent with an iron fist, was out of power. All sorts of political prisoners emerged from dungeon and exile. Smetana was poised to return to the Czech lands right when Czech culture was back. Or potentially back. He figured he could advance his career while also catapulting Czech music to the front and center of European musical life. Prague had just announced a new provisional theater that needed a conductor. The Czech rebirth had arrived in music, and Smetana headed home to throw his name in contention, and with any luck, emerge as a leading voice in a new nationalism. Bit of a side note, but an irony here is that Smetana may be music history's greatest pianist who never made a career of it in concert. His command of technique was up there, by all accounts, with the greatest virtuosos of his day. But his slight frame caused him to tire easily, so rarely could he put in the long hours needed to tour around, where he play some of Liszt's most demanding works. It isn't to say he didn't tour, or at least try to, off and on throughout his whole career. He set off on one right after getting back from Sweden, but due to lack of connections and plain rotten luck, most of these tours were financial disasters. Even Prague didn't seem to care. Whatever fame he'd accrued had been forgotten during his absence.
I feel bad for you.
I don't think about you at all.
One of the existing musical societies was Hlahol, an amateur choir that's still around, and for the voice, Smetana had to learn to set the Czech language. He didn't grow up with the language, so there was a learning curve that got him the last element he needed for his truly mature compositional style, and setting Czech took a long time. Smetana studied the scores of Karel Kryžkovský and his use of folk melody. Smetana developed a working method where the rhythms of the poetry, and thus of the language itself, got embedded into the music. His settings of The Three Riders and The Renegade got him some connections, but he was consistently barred from the elite ranks, such as they were at the time. Czech political society was divided into two factions within the broader National Party, which would formally split in the mid-1870s. These were the Old Czechs and the Young Czechs. Their disagreements in music mostly involved Wagner and musical quotation. The Old Czechs were skeptical of Wagner. He was German. That was a red flag. The Young Czechs were not necessarily pro-Wagner, but at least Wagner curious. The Old Czechs thought folk music was the only way to go. The Young Czechs wanted more options. Smetana's sympathies lay with the New Czechs, and he wasn't looking to make any friends on the other side of that aisle. This combative attitude hurt him way more than it helped him. He got into a shouting match with František Rieger, the leader of the Old Czech faction. Not the kind of thing they teach you in career development seminar. Rieger thought Smetana's music was too German and his politics way too radical, and it was Rieger who denied Smetana the inaugural conducting post at the Prague Provisional Theatre. And sure, the recognition would have been nice, but Smetana came to view the theater as comically small, way too hot, interior temperatures reached upwards of 90 Fahrenheit, unbecoming of a city with grand ambitions. Let's be honest, this was Cope. He totally wanted the job. Czech artists constantly raised funds for a better, permanent, hopefully not wooden building at a better location that would become the National Theatre. And Smetana wanted Czech opera, which they refused to do at the Provisional Theatre. Granted, not much Czech opera existed, but his gripe was that they had this institution. They had the beginning of something real and tangible for themselves, and they didn't even encourage the homegrown stuff. Smetana did an end around and co-founded the Umělecká beseda, a Czech artists' society, one of hundreds of social clubs that popped up that time as Czech intellectuals began to distinguish themselves from their German overlords. Where German language clubs existed, they were either taken over by Czech language ones or were subsumed by emergent Czech language competition. It was a step towards establishing a legitimate musical scene in a city that somehow still lacked a permanent symphony orchestra at the time. Smetana had very, very strong feelings on the makeup of Umělecká beseda, and he didn't like playing politics, he didn't like compromising, and he was partially responsible for the fact that the bylaw debates for this club stretched through their first 5 meetings. Smetana won out, and in the process, he alienated a lot of the old Czechs within the society. In a little over 8 years, the Umělecká beseda grew from 141 to 1,100 members, and as it grew, it shifted away from being just a social club and more towards advocacy of the young Czechs' artistic positions. Smetana also took to the press. Time and time again, he butted against people who didn't like his political leanings or musical tastes. "I see all my endeavors in the field of art postponed to some distant and indefinite date," he once wrote. And if the Provisional Theatre wouldn't give him the time of day, he used his position in the press to attack every last thing about it, especially its director, Jan Nepomuk Meyer, his allegedly overwrought conducting style, and his habit of bringing in what were essentially circus performers to fill the time between operatic acts. This wasn't a Meyer thing. They did it in Gothenburg too, plenty of other places. It's just what you did. It bothered Smetana in provincial Sweden. It incensed him when this kind of thing was happening on home turf. It was a perversion of the art. Large's book pulls a lot from Smetana's diary and kind of makes Meyer out to be the bad guy. Truth is that there was bad blood on both sides. and Smetana, peeved over having been passed over, saw Meyer as everything wrong with the old Czech party, and took every opportunity to lambaste him, up to and including calling him his, quote, personal and irreconcilable enemy, unquote. Like, yeah, I think Smetana might have started it. Up to this point, Smetana's career was that of a good teacher, a great organizer, a frustrated virtuoso, and a gifted critic. Composition trailed behind. His role as critic, engaging with the problems of Czech operatic performances, taught him many lessons. What worked, what didn't, maybe most importantly, somebody needed to write Czech operas. Smetana caught wind of an opera competition given by Count Jan Harak, who wanted works that oozed Czech identity. The Count's heart was in the right place, but the due date of September rolled around, and no one had gotten a piece in. Because turns out writing a Czech national opera when no one had done it before...
It's incredibly hard.
Though Smetana wanted desperately to write Czech music, he disagreed with the Count. The Count sympathized with the old Czechs, and as you'll recall, they felt that Czech music had to quote Czech folk music in order to be valid, steer clear of any outside influences. But no, Smetana argued, if that was all there was, then I don't know, I could write a Latvian national opera if I just happened to get my hands on a book of traditional Latvian folk tunes. As far as I know, I'm not Latvian. It can't just be the folk tunes. The point was to embody the spirit and the character, not just quote something else. With an extended deadline, Smetana got his piece in, as did his arch-rival, Jan Meyer, and also a few other guys. The jury chose, drumroll please, nobody won. They dinged Smetana for his poor understanding of Czech and for including too much dissonance. The only person on his side was theater director František Liegert, who wanted to open the season with Smetana's opera, called The Brandenburgers in Bohemia, but Meyer refused to put it on, and instead of being forced into conducting a piece that he felt had no artistic merit, he washed his hands of it. So with no time to waste, and hardly another competent conductor around, the duty fell to Smetana himself to rehearse and premiere the opera. He was the only guy who could conduct it, even if he hadn't also composed it.
Nasz jazyk kupi, od jejich meczem naród kupi. I z Czernowice Olbrzychu wyniesione za ten sam tak grozny. Owszem se na tym cichym statku bez swe pokoju wnosi. Stelne zwisz po tom hejnu smatku, gdzież po Czechach se rozprostira. Zewiesze brani posina, Czechy praśni, u naszej szelni, ale nasz młodysze umira. Najgorszy to stało prawa, pełni obecny mieszkali. I wielczewska prawa kołkana, czerwosy i pokrali. Můžeme my měšťané, pokud panstvo s námi nevstane. żyje u was i mesi nami w mieście, że możesz stracić nad nim i a hrstka mieścia lub. Nie więc taten krawiec na chladzie, odpropenilien surowi. Nocne jedin lader bicie wzrostą, nie strachuj se, nie strachuj se.
After years of hardship and lack of wide recognition, Brandenburger's was a sheer triumph. Its popularity forced the competition jury's hands, and Smetana won a very belated first prize of 600 gulden.
I'm guessing that's significant.
The title sounds like this might be a comic opera, but it's not. It's historical fiction about the late 1200s when the Margraviate of Brandenburg occupied Bohemia. The anti-German plot was exactly what Czech national opera needed to get off the ground, to harness those feelings from the wider culture. It took some influence from Wagner, but where Wagner opted for myth illuminated by a complex system of constantly developing leitmotifs and a large orchestra, Smetana stuck with historical fiction, played faster and looser with motivic connections, and had to write for a pretty small ensemble. Enough surface-level similarities existed, though, that accusations of Wagnerism would continue to dog Smetana through the rest of his career. Smetana really hit his stride because Brandenburger's only completed its run after Smetana had finished off his next opera. Though it was a great success for a first opera, which are usually misfires, if not outright terrible, Brandenburger's is not well known today, because Smetana's follow-up was The Bartered Bride. It was a project that he'd been kicking around for years, and it became a nice palate cleanser, since it was so light and fluffy compared to the darker Brandenburgers. Smetana tried to claim he'd written it to silence the critics, but in truth it was probably just one guy, Johann Ritter von Herbeck, who'd insulted Czech opera to Smetana's face when the two met in Weimar, and told Smetana that Czech music was just performing, not creating. Given the long history of political repression, what opportunity was there? But it's still kind of a rude thing to say to somebody, so you can see why Smetana might have had that guy's comments in the back of his head and wanted to show him up a little bit. Smetana's bad luck with performances returned with The Bartered Bride, a story about village life given on a hot holiday in a big city with the Austro-Prussian War imminent, so nobody showed up. The politically charged Brandenburgers put a potential target on Smetana's back. As the Prussians invaded Bohemia, Smetana evacuated, along with pretty much everybody else. He was afraid that the Prussians would shoot him in cold blood, and I don't know if they would have if they put two and two together and realized he was the composer of an anti-German opera. It's just that the Prussians were like the evil empire as far as the Czechs were concerned.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
The Austro-Prussian War lasted a little over a month, but it had some wide-ranging effects. For one thing, the Smetanas didn't live in the Austrian Empire anymore. They now lived in Austria-Hungary. When he returned, he basically walked into the role of conductor at the Provisional Theatre. Meyer was out. And in September 1866, Smetana started a job he'd low-key wanted since the theater was founded. No, actually, he'd high-key wanted it since the theater was founded. Nazdovya. Typically, these positions force a person to choose conducting or composing. If there's a compromise, it was restricting composition to the summers. Smetana didn't want to do that. He kept up his pace as an opera composer, at the same time as he tried to enact a broad reformist agenda at the theater. He lifted performance standards, he treated his performers better, and did 40% new productions. It would take many years and many rounds of reworkings before The Bartered Bride became the highly successful opera we know today. It went from flop to the Smetana piece, the Czech opera against which all other Czech operas were judged. As with many composers, his most famous piece was hardly his favorite. It was far, he thought, from his best. He would come to outright hate it at times. He would live in its shadow for the rest of his days. As would literally every other Czech composer. Later on, Antonin Dvorak complained that the Czechs would appreciate new operas, but they weren't interested in any subsequent hearings of them. They just went back to listening to The Bartered Bride over and over. There was a moment in Smetana's life where he'd finished Brandenburgers, was writing The Bartered Bride, and began what was his third opera, Dalibor, to a libretto by the president of Umělecká beseda, Josef Wenzig. If the relaxation of Austrian rule had reignited the fire of Smetana's national pride, the construction of the National Theatre long the goal threw lighter fluid on it. And Smetana was there, witnessed by 60,000 to lay the cornerstone for the new building. In just a few years, he had become the leading figure of Czech music, at least to the young Czechs. Dalibor, when it finally premiered, gave ammunition to Smetana's enemies who accused him of being like Wagner, thus being too German and therefore something of a traitor. It was his first bona fide opera flop and would only find success after his death. By the time it made it to the stage, the public had so fallen for The Bartered Bride to the point they had typecast Smetana and thus Czech opera writ large. His pivotal place in Czech music meant that he was an analogy for a particular direction in which Czech music should go, and the two factions doled it out in words in the press. Old Czechs versus new Czechs. Anti-Smetana versus pro-Smetana. On the fate of what Czech music was and could be. The cultural stakes could not have been higher. Franciszek Pivoda, an umělecká beseda member and supporter of Smetana's early operas, turned on Smetana, who felt that anything Wagner, anything that sniffed of Wagner, risked the independent emerging voice of Czech opera. Smetana himself liked Wagner's music, but as a model he kind of kept it at a distance. He seemed to think of Wagnerian techniques as part of a contemporary operatic composition toolbox, and that there were things to be learned from Wagner that could contribute to this new nationalism. All the same, part of why he wrote The Bartered Bride was to prove that he wasn't just a store-brand Wagner. And really, again, we cannot overlook the Germanness of Wagner. The old Czechs would have been against any outside influence, but the fact he came from their historical oppressors just wouldn't do. Pivoda's screeds against Smetana were so outrageous and galling, calling Smetana old and borderline insane, that Smetana debated giving it all up and just going back to Sweden, where at least they liked him. And only a huge signature gathering campaign and organized ovations convinced Smetana's enemies that they were outnumbered, and convinced Smetana to stick around, that despite what he was seeing in certain papers, he was actually appreciated by a broad section of the Prague public. That criticism in the press did not spill over to affect the nature of his leadership in the orchestra pit. He was relentlessly dedicated to the job. He thought of his work elevating Czech operatic performance to an international standard as an extension of his work in writing Czech national opera. After all, you can't elevate a repertoire where almost none existed. Of the non-Czech productions, they were of more varied national origin than Meyer put on, but no Wagner, right? Large suspects this is because Smetana didn't want to give ammo to his critics. Like, they already thought that he was a Wagner lover. But on a practical level, Wagner's stuff was just way too big for the theater. He followed Dalibor with Libuše, about the mythical founding of Prague, which was going to be more than an opera. He envisioned Libuše as a new kind of Czech music, and this piece its greatest embodiment. He believed it would hold a unique place in the music of his people. Which are kind of Wagnerian ambitions, gotta say, but redirected and recast for a Czech national project. Smetana is at his most Wagnerian when he starts from Wagnerian first principles, right? Going back to mythology to craft something that holds political weight and relevance. The antagonist, Krudoš, is a German sympathizer who wants to do things as the Germans do them.
Pierre!
Granted, Smetana's involvement in the theater did slow him down, but after his first 3 operas, which stumbled over each other out of his pen, he took years with Libouche. He was going over the score with a fine-tooth comb to get the emphasis on the right syllable. He was holding it back for an appropriate milestone in the life of the Czech nation, which he hoped would be for the coronation of Franz Josef as King of the Czechs. That was the eternal goal, it seemed, among some of the young Czechs. And when that didn't materialize for at least the second time, he saw it as a fitting opener for the National Theatre once that building was finally together. To Smetana, Libouche and the opening of the National Theatre became 2 sides of a larger project. This meant that throughout the 1870s, this opera gained its own mini-mythology. It premiered in June 1881, almost 9 years after he'd finished it. In the meantime, he was dealing with constant attacks from the old Czechs, and since Libouche was not yet ready for the public, and his friends convinced him he needed a new opera to remind the public that he still had it, and he chose to rebuke the idea he wasn't faithful to Czech music by doing a new opera based on a French play called The Two Widows, which Prague had liked in translation about a decade before he started work on the opera. The Two Widows took a while to come out, and the result was pretty middling in terms of reception history. Smetana thought smaller scale, something lighter to balance out the serious historical or mythological epics. Think more Mozart than Wagner for this one. This did nothing to quell the haters, who called him a Wagner ripoff, constantly agitated for Meyer's reinstatement, and would try to find other Czech composers to champion to topple Smetana's prominence. One of them being a young Antonin Dvorak, who didn't have any antipathy towards Smetana. And they were artistic competitors on some level, and they envied the other's successes on certain fronts. But Dvorak premiered Smetana's works, and Smetana conducted parts of early Dvorak symphonies, and both had nice things to say most of the time about the other. Smetana regarded Dvorak's productivity with a certain amount of suspicion, and suggested that Dvorak wasn't as familiar with the intricacies of Czech folk music and Czech folk dances as he was. The later Czech dances were intended to put Dvorak in his place by specifying the names of the dances as the movement titles, because Dvorak's Slavonic dances didn't do that. Smetana's music tends to be monothematic, where a whole piece would be based on the transformation of a single motive, something he borrowed from Liszt. Smetana believed that truly national art would be stifled if stuffed into old forms, thus his tendency towards the futurists like Liszt and Wagner, and his desire to never write the same opera twice. There's also an affinity for long pedal points in his music, possibly inspired by certain folk instruments, and the use of the clarinet in the ensemble is his sort of trademark Czech instrument. Czech culture has a number of traditional dances, and like many kinds of folk music, it shares certain characteristics with the language. Czech words put the stress on the first syllable, and Czech music likes to put a big emphasis on beat 1. and I'd like to think that those two are related. As his style developed, he gained a penchant for sudden modulations and ever more daring harmonies. His orchestration was, a little bit like Robert Schumann's, affected by the nature of the ensembles for which he wrote. The provisional theater was a tiny outfit, and he had to make do with less. In the end, the old Czechs got their way at the provisional theater. Smetana had to give up his post, and Meyer returned. But it wasn't because of anything the aforementioned haters had written. In July 1874, Smetana noticed a peculiar effect where sounds in different registers were warped. It sounded out of tune. And at one point he heard flute music coming from nowhere, rushing, roaring sounds in his ears. Extreme tinnitus and balance issues followed. He couldn't tell one voice from another. He requested a leave of absence from the theater, citing his new condition and warning them that if it didn't get better, he would have to resign. There was no way he could conduct under those circumstances. Well, it didn't get better. He went deaf in his right ear first, then on October 20th, 1874, he was stone cold deaf. He went deaf on the same day Charles Ives was born. And you thought I wouldn't get an Ives reference in a video about a non-American composer, huh? The doctors tried everything. But this was 1874, so their best ideas were such amazing ideas as soaking cotton balls in weird substances and sticking them in his ears. Or putting tubes up his nostrils. That was another one. The following year, he'd undergo an even more bizarre treatment. Get this. He was kept in sensory deprivation solitary confinement for 4.5 weeks. Right? A month. Interrupted only for meals and the application of various stinky pastes all over his body, which may have contained mercury. Like, genuinely, one of the weirder things I've read making these videos. There was also that classic of 19th century medicine, shock therapy. I shouldn't laugh. This is awful. He would, in ensuing years, consult ever quackier doctors with ever wackier treatments, like stabbing him in the neck. Somehow none of these things worked. The longer things went, the less optimistic Smetana was. Deafness, he wrote, wouldn't be so bad if it didn't have that infernal roaring, augmented by occasional shrieking sounds and dissonant trumpet fanfares. One wonders how much of this was strictly speaking tinnitus, and how much may have been broader auditory hallucinations brought on by a disease he contracted in the early months of 1874, syphilis, a nasty STD that presents in all sorts of crazy ways over the course of an infection. When left untreated, madness invariably ensues. This diagnosis was confirmed in 1987 when his body was exhumed and inspected. Whether Smetana himself knew he had this is up for debate, but his family really did seem to know what was happening to him. Syphilis was neither new nor rare, and people were familiar with its wide array of symptoms. Good thing he was capable of composing without the piano. Probably because he didn't have steady access to one growing up. And he pressed on, despite everything, despite the new challenges to his life, to compose what's probably his most famous non-operatic work, the cycle of tone poems called Ma Vlast, a project he'd started back in 1872. Freed from the need to work with a librettist or encode a story and characters in a way that could fit on the small provisional theater stage, Smetana turned his pen to a mix of pastoral sketches and stories imbued with Czech history and myth. The finale, Blaník, combines all three. It's based on the story of the followers of early Protestant Jan Hus, who, legend holds, escaped to Blaník Mountain and there sleep until the Czechs' darkest hour, when they will emerge again and fight for Czech glory. Smetana had constant financial troubles after he went deaf. The syphilis hasn't yet affected his memory, and he was still one of the best pianists in the Czech lands, if not the best, right? Even deaf, he was great, but he was getting more frail, so playing more to make up the financial deficit was just totally out of the picture. His problems were exacerbated by some poor marketing choices. He practically gave away the publication rights to Mavlast, and now that Meyer was back in charge at the Provisional Theatre, everyone who'd shown love to Smetana now found themselves out of a job.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
He was forced to come groveling back to the Provisional Theatre, whose chairman offered him a small yearly stipend in exchange for the rights to his old operas, and for him to give them new operas on a somewhat regular basis. All on not nearly enough to get him out of debt. Yet the pro-Meyer people were writing these op-eds about how what they were paying him was more than enough to live on, and he should be happy, and why is he complaining? Only problem was they weren't actually paying him. They would later try to cut his salary almost in half, and even then, they weren't good about paying on time. His old friends organized benefit concerts and took up funds, and in gratitude he wrote the piano suite Dreams, which is still pretty well known in the modern Czech Republic, but less known outside of it. It was a return to piano writing after more than a decade away from his own instrument. Structurally and texturally, Dreams is a little bit of a throwback to an earlier Romantic era. Schumann and Chopin have their fingerprints all over the score, not to mention classic Lisztian textures as well. The harmony, however, is on another level. His pupil Josef Jaranek criticized some of the harmony and suggested that there were some wrong notes. Jaranek probably figured that his teacher's deafness had something to do with it. Smetana chewed him out. Now, to be fair to Jaranek, there are some very unusual intervals in here, like diminished octaves, uncharacteristically spicy even for someone as harmonically progressive as Smetana. Commentators draw parallels between Mavlast and Dreams. They're both written around the same time, they're both large scale, they're both the first major pieces of instrumental music written after his deafness. To me, Dreams represents a midpoint between the outward nationalism of Mavlast and his personal autobiographical chamber works. The pieces in the collection all have French titles, as it was the international language of the nobility, and his pupils from that class were the ones who raised all the money for him. But the fundraising wasn't enough to cover rent and debts, and he was forced to move back in with his daughter in the countryside in Jabknice, northeast of Prague. He was often beset by vertigo and depression. Well, until a new project came along. A new opera, The Kiss, with a libretto by Eliška Krasnohorska, which turned out to be such a success that Smetana had the money to throw a lavish Christmas celebration. True to form, he threw himself right into his next project, the string quartet subtitled From My Life. Smetana was never much of a chamber music composer. He believed in program music, the kinds of music that lend itself to these older forms, the forms that people like Liszt rejected. Those weren't usually his thing. So when he did turn his pen to chamber music, it was usually private confessional pieces about something in his own life, like that G minor trio we talked about earlier. And it's conceived about as broadly as his orchestral music, to the point that the quartet took 2 years to be premiered because everyone in Prague thought it was too difficult. It's a brilliant piece, and well known for its imitation of Smetana's tinnitus that heralded his deafness. He wrote to Liszt that early in his slide into deafness, between 6 and 7 in the evening, he would hear a high A-flat major chord, like in super high piccolos. For the E in From My Life, which he wanted shrill and steady and fortissimo, he provided 2 explanations. One, that it was what he literally heard as the first symptom, like that was the pitch he heard as the tinnitus, and the other was that it was an abstraction of, his words, the fearful catastrophe of that super high A-flat piccolo chord. A-flat might have been more accurate to his experience, but A-flat doesn't work all that well on string instruments. E minor is much more resonant. It's absolutely in the top 3 best-known Smetana pieces. What's less known is his later D minor quartet, which picks up right where the E minor left off, although by the point he got around to writing that one, his memory had changed for the worse. Doctors had ordered him not to compose as early as Dream, since he was in a state of borderline nervous exhaustion at all times. Might have been the only properly medical advice they ever gave him, but it was also the one he should have ignored. He pressed on, because writing music was the only thing that he enjoyed in his otherwise miserable life. He'd had good fortune working with Krasnohorska, who had the added benefit of not asking for money for her librettos. This next opera became The Secret, which, in the predictable pattern of ups and downs in his career, was a box office flop. His friends kinda blamed Krasnohorska. It seems a little misogynistic to me. They said that she was the problem, but he was committed to that collaboration, and she remained his collaborator for The Devil's Wall. The third time was not the charm, at least not for their collaboration. Creative differences over genre caused a split. His memory, once prodigious, began to fail. His lightning pace at composition slowed to a mere trickle. And yet, while The Parted Bride was just reaching a landmark 100th performance, towering over all other Czech opera by a country mile, The Devil's Wall became yet another failure. In part because the production quality made 1980s Doctor Who look good by comparison.
I said, where are my specimens?
This was the last straw of an ailing psyche and an ailing body. Smetana began suffering attacks where he couldn't think or say anything except for a few wheezed nonsense syllables over and over. His personality changed, and his relationship with Betty, which had been on the rocks for years, finally collapsed. He gave her money for safekeeping, then accused her of stealing it from him. He felt persecuted by her. She felt disgusted by his wretched state. When composing, he could hardly remember the music he'd just written down, and yet he just kept writing. The aforementioned D minor quartet, as well as his White Whale, an opera based on Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. He'd wanted to for ages, and he had a Krasnohorska libretto at the ready, but his faculties fully left him in February 1884. He babbled until his throat got hoarse, and was physically violent, frequently hallucinating. By late April, he'd been taken to an asylum. He refused to eat, and he conducted constantly out of motor memory. His body finally gave out in May, at the age of 60.
I believe we're in a battle for the soul of this nation. I still believe that to be true.
Even during his life, Smetana was a symbol, a figure who represented, well, what did you want him to represent? What does it mean to be a national hero? A representative of one's music to the world, when internal divisions on what it meant to be Czech and represent Czechness were so hotly debated? What does it mean to be the Czech composer of the Czech opera when most of your operas weren't even treated all that well when they were premiered? Smetana is often portrayed as the source and origin of Czechness in music, and while he was the earliest significant figure in this nationalist movement, his place in the canon has been exacerbated by a lot of later myth-making. He was the first to write good Czech opera, Czech national opera, but even there, the Czech public's tastes owed much to figures like Meyer, whose affinity for lighter Italian stuff helps explain why The Bartered Bride went viral, while many others flopped. The writing around Smetana can lean into the loneliness of being first, the burden of starting a tradition and not being recognized in your time for it. But the truth is that Smetana existed in a wider context of Czech nationalism in music. There are many people who agreed with him, and outside the opera house, other composers were drawing from that same well, including Zdeněk Fibich, whose tone poem Zaboj, Slavoj, and Luděk predates Ma Vlast. I'd rank Fibich fourth among the Czech musical founding fathers, but you've probably never heard of him. Fourth place doesn't get a medal. Ma Vlast may have been the first such piece to have been remembered by history, but we have to keep in mind that it came from a larger context. Smetana was not a lone wolf. He was an artistic leader of a winning aesthetic faction. Large characterizes Fibich as Smetana's pupil, a connection I'm frankly having a hard time corroborating, and which I think mischaracterizes Smetana in the larger Czech context. Fibich was a younger contemporary of Dvořák. You zoom out at all to look at Czech music in a broader socio-political context, you can see that Large ends up making a kind of flimsy case for Smetana's originality that unfairly sidelines Fibich. Smetana did not introduce program music to this young nation. It was commonly discussed among the young Czech musicians. It was frequently a topic of debate in their publications. In 1871, members of Umělecká beseda started Matice hudební, a publishing house that, in their scholarship, leaned into the idea of Smetana as the Czechs' answer to Liszt and Wagner. To Smetana, these were important influences on his thinking, and Liszt was a good and supportive personal friend, but they were by no means on the same musical team. And Smetana's operas bear very little resemblance to true Wagnerian music drama. Like, unless you call anyone who uses recurring motivic material or draws on mythology Wagnerian, in which case, like, you're going to include a lot of people who aren't Wagnerian. They wanted to cast Smetana as, at best, a bridge between Czech music and the rest of the world, to bring Liszt and his legitimacy into the Czech sphere. At worst, this was a downplaying of Smetana's Czechness when projected outwards in order to curry favor under the Habsburgs in the quest for further Czech autonomy. Now, after his death, Umělecká beseda changed gears, and they turned into something like a Smetana society, and they changed their take on his relationship to the greater Czech nation-building project. His old friends even started going after younger composers who they felt were deviating from the course set for them by Smetana's vision. So Antonin Dvořák, a Smetana supporter, got targeted by these people. They didn't think he checked out. I'm sorry. I managed to get through this whole thing without making that pun. Kelly St. Pierre, in her book Bedřich Smetana, Myth, Music, and Propaganda, makes the case that Smetana, as this man of the people, originated at the beginning of his operatic composition by members of Umělecká beseda. I can't accuse these people of fabricating stories, but they weren't above playing up the Czech elements of Smetana and omitting the things that would align him too strongly with other schools. Certainly they engaged in revisionism. Krasnohorska participated by burning any of Smetana's letters if said letters evidenced his poor understanding of Czech grammar. And the librettist for the first two operas, Karel Sabina, was dogged by accusations of being a traitor, and so he was blamed for Smetana's Czech-setting deficiencies there, somehow. Umělecká beseda began to cultivate the fine arts in Bohemia, but by Smetana's death, it had adopted a more nationalistic tone, promoting Czech art rather than art that happened to be Czech. As Kelly St. Pierre puts it, now members wanted to promote Czech as an aesthetic category, inventing its history and identifying its artistic leaders. After Smetana's death, Czech nationalism became a push for Czech independence, and later Czechoslovakian scholarship on Smetana downplayed any outside influence in the quest for turning him into a visionary national hero, and eventually an embodiment of state propaganda during the communist years. Neither of these perspectives show the nuances of a composer living and working in a larger creative and socio-political environment. Smetana, by virtue of his relative primacy, had a malleable legacy ripe for exploitation in any direction. When Prague was liberated from Nazi occupation, the first thing they did was put on a production of The Bartered Bride. Now, the communist era of Czechoslovakia further problematized Smetana's scholarship. Miroslav Barvik, then the head of the Czechoslovakia Composers Union, said that all writing on Smetana should be infused with state ideology, which in practice meant emptying Smetana of his personhood and then using his likeness as a figurehead, as this representative of Czechness, especially when you compare his music to the more dissonant contemporary stuff from the 1940s and 1950s. There was a certain aesthetic conservatism for a lot of the Eastern Bloc, and Smetana became an embodiment of this nationalist romanticism that they really liked, and they wanted their composers to emulate. Smetana's historical role as a focal point for Czech liberation and individual identity was a potential problem. So his legacy was further neutered by the communist regime's inaugural Minister of Culture and Education, Zdeněk Nejedlý. A Stalinist by persuasion, he enacted his own purges of intellectuals and enforced within Czechoslovakia the artistic doctrine of Moscow's Andrei Zhdanov. More on the Zhdanov doctrine over in my Khachaturian video. Nejedlý's teacher, Otakar Hostinsky, was a Smetana acolyte who believed Smetana was the source and origin of everything modern Czech music, and Nejedlý enforced communist ideology by linking it to the Czech past, from figures like Jan Hus all the way through to Smetana. Nejedlý tried to write a biography of Smetana, but everything he came across seemed to him like important information, so he completed multiple volumes of this biography, but he never got past Smetana turning 19. What did he do? Tell you what he had for breakfast every day of his life? Gee whiz. The Composers Union came out with a Smetana 5-year plan for the composer's 125th birthday, a sort of mandatory propagandistic fun. And so by the end of communist rule and the dissolution of Czechoslovakia shortly thereafter, the long association of Smetana with communist-era propaganda fundamentally changed the way Czechs viewed one of their great cultural heroes. Smetana represented at best a symbol of this bygone Czechness, and I think that's kind of a shame. Internationally, Smetana is known more about than really known. Outside The Bartered Bride, Ma Vlast, and the E minor quartet, you really have to go to the Czech Republic to hear a lot of his work today. Smetana's music was conceived as being by a Czech for Czechs. Operatic performances abroad tended to fizzle for one reason or another, and that still holds true today to some extent, especially when you get into the deep cuts. And yet, in any discussion of music from that part of the world, how waves of nationalism spread through Europe and manifested themselves in romantic music, Smetana will inevitably come up. He is the embodiment of Czech music. But the more you peel away the curtains of history, the more you find a man at the crossroads of his culture. a man who fought for what he believed in, and happened to be on the winning side of the musical front of a larger battle for the soul of the Czech nation. And though he achieved a great many of his goals, they came at a steep price. Dates were pushed and pulled, his Germanic upbringing became an obstacle to overcome, and his deafness became this martyrdom for the nation, bravely pushing through to new heights of expression. To mangle a quote from Voltaire, "If Smetana did not exist, it would have been necessary to invent him."